A small salt mining town once known for the healing properties of a nearby mineral spa. Its name now tied forever to one of the worst acts of violence in Europe since the Second World War. 25 years after the Srebrenica massacre, what does the future hold for a still fractured region? Hello from me, David Foster. You're watching Roundtable. The Balkans conflict has officially been over for 19 years, but tensions still surface. Is the international community really doing all it can to bring lasting peace?
The 1995 Srebrenica genocide, in which almost 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed, was the worst atrocity in Europe since the Second World War. The Dayton Agreement, which ended the Bosnian War, dividing the country into two entities, the Bosniak and Croat Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serb Republika Srpska. 25 years on, geopolitical analysts say Bosnia remains deeply ethnically divided with a weak central government. There is no agreement about many of the basic facts of the war, and neither Republika Srpska nor Serbia recognise that a genocide took place in Srebrenica. In April, the Bosnian Serb President Milorad Dodik called for greater autonomy for Republika Srpska, and in the past has called for secession from Bosnia. There are questions too about Kosovo. The international community wants to revive a proposed land swap deal that would allow Serbia to become part of the EU and Kosovo to become a member of the United Nations. The US had recently organised talks between Kosovo and Serbia, but they were postponed when the Kosovan president was indicted on war crimes charges. A quarter of a century after the massacre at Srebrenica, the risk of more conflict has not gone away.
Very pleased to say that joining us from Oxfordshire, we have Charles Crawford, who was formerly the British ambassador to Bosnia and to Serbia and held other posts in the region. In Sarajevo, we welcome Denis Dzidic, Bosnia director of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, BN. And in Graz University, Austria, we have Florian Bieber, a Balkans expert and professor of Southeast European Studies. Great to have you all on the programme. Denis, your group has recently helped pull together a report called Democracy After Coronavirus and say it is being eroded. It was being eroded in Central and Southeast European countries before COVID-19. In Sarajevo, so much at the heart of the Balkans conflict, what is the position now?
The situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina is perhaps a little bit better than in other countries simply because of the constitutional setup of the country. There is an institutional setup that requires there to be multiple voices, multiple ethnic groups that are in the constitution. In other countries, we have seen, such as Serbia, Albania, a much more autocratic regimes popping up and less democratic freedoms available. Obviously, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I don't want to make it sound as if the situation is perfect, is rosy. We have seen during the pandemic very, very autocratic decisions being made, less freedom, less media freedom available.
Charles Crawford, was that something that you were aware of when you criticised the peace accords, the Dayton Accords that ended the conflict in Bosnia itself, if not the wider Balkans conflict? Were you worried that democracy just wouldn't be able to survive?
Well, I think the point about the Dayton Peace Accord and the whole process was that it sort of stopped the conflict, but it didn't end it. It sort of redefined it. It pushed it from a civil war military context into a political context. And so the way the Dayton Agreement was set up did, as the last speaker said, guarantee a lot of political freedoms, the top level political freedoms, best in Europe, best in the world. All that was on paper. The problem was that the sort of underlying logic of the settlement, whereby there were, if you like, one country, three communities, but only two entities, is sort of unbalanced. It's unbalanced in principle. And there were reasons why it was done that way. But the fact that it's unbalanced and the fact that almost every community in effect has a block on changing it makes it very difficult to go anywhere. It's sort of like a car which is beautifully designed, but it can't get out of the garage.
And what have you seen since you left Bosnia in terms of the progress or lack of that the area has made?
Well, I think there's a lot of progress in terms of rebuilding. Go to Sarajevo. It's transformed, of course. But I think the what's striking about looking at it from afar now is how the political questions which are still being talked about and the blocking and the lack of commitment, I think, to a clear market economy on behalf of everybody means that you could have exactly the same conversation at any point in the last, whatever it is, 25 years since Dayton ended, and it would be pretty much the same conversation. But I think it is nonetheless, on some existential level, pretty depressing that Bosnia hasn't done better, given the amount of support and money and effort and commitment and goodwill that it's had.
Yeah, and we'll talk about who might be to blame for that as we go through the course of the program. But Florian, let me come to you. Denis talked about a multi-representational system in Bosnia, and what comes to mind for me, having spent a lot of time reporting out of the Middle East, when it comes to a similar setup, is Lebanon, and they say there it is always doomed to fail.
Well, there are lots of parallels with Lebanon in the system, in the way that it's always said to be doomed to fail, and it never seems to fail entirely. I think, of course, in Bosnia, it's based on a more rigid institutional system, also more territorialized than in Lebanon. But what is similar is also, I think, as we've heard, is that also makes it, Lebanon was for a long time more democratic than many of its neighboring countries, not because it was inherently so, but because decision-making required consensus among different elites. They're not democratic within their own right, but they have to work together. And that's a similar situation in Bosnia, where it's not more democratic inherently than its neighbors, especially Serbia, but it structurally is conditioned to work more democratically, but also inherent with blockages. That's one of the biggest weaknesses of Dayton, is that it makes it very easy for blocking any decisions.
Okay, Denis, let me come to you. You mentioned genocide denial, and I want to ask you, since the reason we're doing this program is 25 years on from the Srebrenica massacre, what the situation is with regarding genocide denial.
Well, the situation is extremely difficult. Not only are you seeing the same narratives of political denial that we have seen for months and years now from the same political elites in Serbia and in Republika Srpska locally, but we are now actually seeing an institutionalization of this denial. So basically, the Republika Srpska authorities have last year adopted a resolution to create a so-called international committee that is going to look at the verdicts related to Srebrenica, at so-called evidence related to Srebrenica, and its role is to determine the truth about the events. The problem being is that all of the participants in this so-called international group are people who have a history of genocide denial, are people who have already openly stated that they are against the verdicts, that they are not accepting the classification of genocide related to Srebrenica.
I beg your pardon, I was just going to say, so do you think any of the wounds have healed?
I think very little of the wounds have healed. Bosnia and Herzegovina has been relatively successful in prosecuting war crimes and genocide. So we have seen hundreds of war crime cases finished, both internationally but also locally. However, it has not implemented systematically any mechanisms of transitional justice, any mechanisms of facing the past. We have not seen any kind of institutional vetting, lustration, any kind of cohesive memorialization, reparation for victims. And as a result, we are simply not seeing kind of reconciliation.
Okay, Charles, let me talk about the international community. There's been a suggestion of bags of effort, bags of goodwill, but let's go back to the start of the conflict, when it was suggested that if Britain backed the recognition of Croatia, then France would actually give Britain a free ride on the Maastricht Treaty, which was an opt-out of certain European clauses. Has the international community atoned for what it seemed to do in being implicit in starting all of this?
Well, the international community didn't start this. This is absolutely clear. I mean, I suppose the issue with all these...
Or allowing it to happen.
Well, it's not really for the international community to run around stopping things happening. I mean, if you do that, you get into trouble for other reasons. I think you have to remember at the time, the absolutely biggest story in the world was the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had crashed, and we were all scrambling around. I was there in London in the Soviet department trying to work out where the new international borders should be for the new bits of the Soviet Union emerging as new countries. And the question then was, do you roll across the principles you've established in the Soviet Union to Yugoslavia, which was also fraying badly at the edges at that point? And the decision was taken for reasonable reasons. I think other people agreed with it, to try to accept that Yugoslavia would break up along the internal borders of Yugoslavia, the so-called republics of Yugoslavia. And that had consequences. And the areas which were most, if you like, multi-ethnic were the ones which were going to be fought over. And that was, of course, Bosnia itself, which was the most multi-ethnic part of Bosnia.
So no blame should be attached to the international community for what happened and for what has been allowed to happen since then?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by blame. I think you can identify all sorts of ways in which we might have intervened. I mean, there was talk of spending a couple of $1 billion to keep Yugoslavia together, but at the time that seemed like a lot of money and no one wanted to do it. The real difficulty that emerged, and I think it was hinted at in the one of the earlier comments, was that the Bosnia issue, and indeed any international issue, is never really just about the issue itself. It's about other relationships. And in particular, at that time, the Clinton administration absolutely refused to put soldiers on the ground in foreign places. And so that meant that the countries which did have soldiers on the ground in Bosnia as peacekeepers were very careful about the mandate. They didn't want to get involved in a fighting match where the Americans were saying, go on and fight, but the Americans weren't committing to it. And this was a serious breakdown, if you like, in Western coordination. So there's plenty of blame to allocate there on both sides of the Atlantic if you want to allocate.
And as you say, incredibly complicated. That is what happened 25, 30 years ago. This is something that Valentin Inzko, the UN High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, said only last month. He was addressing the UN Security Council via video link. We should be patient with BiH, that is Bosnia and Herzegovina, and very cautious about changing the international setup in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We should, as the international community, work together. So my question for you, Florian, since Charles has referred to the international community's role in the past, what is it doing now other than paying its UN High Representative 24,000 euros a month?
Very little. I mean, of course, there's a limitation of what international actors can do 25 years after the end of the war. In the first decade after 95, there was a very serious engagement. The High Representative was now Valentin Inzko, whom you've mentioned. His predecessors, including Patty Ashton, had a very strong mandate. They imposed laws, they dismissed officials. But you cannot do this 20 years after the end of the war as some kind of unelected official to do such a kind of massive intervention. Probably the international community, if we can speak of even one community, took a step back too early around 2005. Took more of a laissez-faire approach towards Bosnia. And this was really a moment when things started to get worse. And now, of course, you cannot undo what was done more than 10, rather 15 years ago. But I think the big problem is that there is kind of a sense of hopelessness among international community, what to do with Bosnia, how to help Bosnia become a more functional state. I mean, a few years ago, there was the hope that EU integration would be the kind of miracle cure, that would bring the country together and unleash some kind of willingness to reform. But this is not really kind of crystallized, partly because EU membership is too far away, too abstract, and a large part of the elite actually likes the status quo. They like living in this limbo. They can extract resources. It's very clientelistic as a system, and EU membership is actually a threat to their power. So they only would do it if their citizens pressure them. And the citizens are often told that it's the other ethnic group or the other ethnic leader who is to blame for not making progress. So I think external actors, they're quite disunited, US and EU, not always seeing eye to eye, not to mention Russia. But also there's a limit of what they can do at this particular point in helping Bosnia onward.
Well, on that point, Denis, let me quote to you what Milos Damjanovic, who's one of your colleagues at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, put down on paper. With EU membership off the agenda for the next few years, the region risks changing for the worse, resulting in less reform and more democratic backsliding, authoritarianism, corruption, and political polarization. Let's go through some of the tensions that exist at the moment.
All right. Well, some of the tensions that exist in the moment are the same tensions that have been existing for a very long time. The problem being is that, over time, since they have not been dealt with, they are becoming gradually more severe, and the narratives more enshrined in the, in the general narrative of the political elites, and because the political elites control much of the media space, then we are seeing this spread out onto the general narratives in the public. Unfortunately, this is the same old stories. We are seeing a rise of revisionism related to the war. We are seeing an extreme amount of narratives related to radicalization, extremism, terrorism. Some of it's related to migrants, some of them it's related to...
So sorry to butt in, but where does the Kosovo Serbia possible land swap, what they've called, I think, border correction, fit into this? There's supposed to be a meeting next month in Paris between the two countries. I don't know the status of that at the moment. Is that causing tension?
In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is a worry that once or if such an agreement is finally made, which is definitely not something that we can say will happen or won't happen, that it could be something that is going to be used as some sort of leverage or some sort of potentially idea that something like that could happen to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And once you start opening up borders and agreeing some sort of swaps, that potentially this could affect the setup of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because as we know, there are significant parts of the establishment in Republika Srpska which are publicly stating that they wish for independence or to merge with Serbia. I would not think that these are serious threats at this point, more political statement, something that is made just for their voters, simply because Bosnia and Herzegovina is in a constant political pre-election campaign, since we are having elections every 2 years. So unfortunately, this is something that happens, but I wouldn't expect it to be anything that is extremely serious at this point.
Okay, Charles, let me talk to you about that. The Kosovo land swap's been described there by Denis quite accurately as confusing. Others have said it's opening up a Pandora's box. It might encourage Republika Srpska to push even more strongly for secession. Do you think that is likely? And do you think Republika Srpska will become an independent nation, even if it's not recognized as such?
Well, absolutely not. You can make the case in the opposite direction, that the whole point of a land swap between Kosovo and Serbia would be that both Belgrade and Pristina are agreeing to it. And it only happens because they're agreeing to it. And that gives Sarajevo, in the Bosniak community, a veto on any land swap involving Bosnia. So that's quite clear. So I think you could make the case that in a way it doesn't affect Bosnia at all. Now, we've seen with Catalonia what happens if you try to lunge for independence. Republika Srpska, if it tried to lunge for independence, would collapse for sure. It wouldn't have any international support. Support from Serbia wouldn't get it anywhere. So they're sort of stuck, and they know that, and they keep making silly noises, which get people interested now and again. But it's not going anywhere. But the difficulty is, as I think Florian said, everyone can veto everything. And it doesn't follow that because Republika Srpska isn't going anywhere, that Bosnia is going somewhere. And, underlying all this is a big sort of existential question about what President Izetbegovic personally described to me as ethnic disarmament. He said it's very difficult to have ethnic disarmament in Bosnia where people really start trusting each other, given the logic of Bosnia as part of a wider space involving Serbs and Croats. I mean, there's a sort of dynamic to the Yugoslavia space, which is very, very clear and very specific, and it doesn't belong to one country there. So somehow all this has to be settled in a wider context, but yet it's never settled, and this is where we are.
But this is the point, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about what can officially be done through the channels that have been set up, and we've seen in the past what happens in the Balkans when people disagree with what is being done officially. They take matters into their own hands. So is continuing turmoil, perhaps conflict, a possibility?
Well, I'm always struck when you look on YouTube at the map of Europe, how if you go back 700 years and you watch the map of Europe changing as countries pop up and down and empires grow and fall and so on and so on and so on. There was Bosnia 700 years ago. Then it disappears from the map and then it comes back again. So there are deeper rhythms in all this, which are very, very big sort of cycles of some sort. And, you know, we keep talking as if there's a natural, happy place we can park the problem so that it will never arise again. And the fact is, there isn't that place. And if there had been that place, we wouldn't have been having these conversations over the last 700 years or so. So the Dayton borders won't survive for 500 years for sure. They might survive for another 50. That's maybe okay. I don't know. It's hard to say. But sooner or later, the issue will arise again because it always does.
Dennis, I want to come back to you towards the end of the programme to ask you about Sarajevo, the city, today. But Florian, let me ask you this one. Other potential flashpoints. The president of Kosovo being indicted for war crimes, allegedly to do with running an organ-stealing ring. And I'm talking about human organs there. He says he'll quit if it goes any further. But, I mean, do these so often concurrent tensions cloud the bigger issues, or are they something to be concerned about?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think, you know, a lot of the tensions are top down in the region. I mean, they're not driven by citizens who pick up arms and want to fight. I think they're often by elites who exploit tensions and kind of fan the flames of conflict. So I think we have to be very careful that also conflict in Bosnia is not likely as long as elites don't want it. I mean, the war in Yugoslavia was elite driven. Now, you know, I think the indictment or the possible indictment of President Thaci in Kosovo is a positive thing. You know, these things often interfere with political processes, but at the same time, you know, as we've heard, big challenge is that the wars of the 90s are not fully dealt with. In none of the parts of the societies has been a full reckoning of what happened, you know, acceptance of responsibility of the own leaders. Now, of course, it's not implying that responsibility was equally distributed everywhere, but it just means that there was been kind of insufficient recognition of responsibility on each side. So I think prosecution, war crimes trials, but also other mechanisms of transitional justice are, you know, severely needed, because otherwise the legacy of the 90s is going to fester and is going to create future problems. And I think this is something where, in a certain way, these processes do matter and do have, I think, at the end of the day, a positive effect for the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Dennis, you're in Sarajevo, the center of so much trouble during the Bosnian War. What does it feel like today, COVID notwithstanding?
Well, Sarajevo, as you know, as a day-to-day city, is pretty much rebuilt. I think as a legacy of the war, you see very little of it now in the sense of destruction. However, there are extreme, I would say, underlying issues that have not been dealt with from all sides. From one position, you have not seen the prosecution of anybody out of the direct perpetrators of the siege of Sarajevo, and that's an extremely significant problem in the sense of justice to be made for the thousands of victims. Secondly, you are not seeing, as I mentioned before, transitional justice mechanisms being implemented in schools, for instance, memorialization. So it is not inclusive in that sense, and there's not a fact-based approach to developing a common cohesive narrative for the country, which could start from Sarajevo.
Very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, we are running out of time. 25 years after the Srebrenica massacre, you are in Sarajevo. Are you hopeful for your city, for your generation's future?
I'm extremely hopeful for my generation's future. I think that in the sense of how little has been done in the sense of reconciliation and transitional justice institutionally, the fact that you are not seeing any kind of significant attacks between different ethnic groups, attacks against returnees. These are incidents that happen and they're extremely problematic, but they're not widespread. I think that tells you that there's not an extreme appetite at all for any kind of conflict. So I'm extremely hopeful for this young generation. There are certain problems, especially in schools, the fact that they are not being taught peace education, that they are not being taught transitional justice, that their school system is not reliant on facts and court-determined facts. I think this is a huge issue that needs to be dealt with, but I would say that I am extremely hopeful.
Listen, thank you. Thank you very much indeed to all three of you. The tensions are still there. They will perhaps remain, but relatively peaceful for now, 25 years after the massacre at Srebrenica. Thank you very much indeed to all of my guests. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster. Until next time, goodbye.